right, good morning everybody, how you doing? For those of you who might be new in the class, I'm teaching out of a book called In the Beginning, written by a man named Dr. Walt Brown. Describes a theory, it describes a lot actually, but the middle part of the book describes a theory, a scientific theory for the global flood. And I personally have studied this for a number of years and think it's by far and away the most biblically supported and scientifically supported flood model. And it explains a lot of unusual features of the Earth and even out beyond the Earth. And so right now, we're in a section that explains what are called frozen mammoths. And so last week we talked just a little bit about what a mammoth is. So mammoth is basically, it's a big member of the elephantid genus, which is basically very closely related to modern elephants. And these were found in the upper Arctic Circle. I'll show you this map here, we showed this last week here. But these remains of these were found frozen deep inside the earth in many cases. And this is just the finds that have been actually discovered. Then there's been evidences that there were many, many more mammoths that lived in this area. Up above the Arctic Circle, which is an area which is typically a very, very cold environment. It's not well suited for an animal like this to live in. And we'll talk a bit more about that today and some of the mysterious aspects of, well, how did these animals come to thrive in an area like this? How did so many of them come to be here when the environment is harsh, it's extremely cold, and just really wouldn't support an animal like this. Like an elephant doesn't live in this kind of an area, and this is a very closely related animal to an elephant. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today as well. But the Arctic Circle is the southern boundary of what's called the polar zone. And that's described basically as an area above which there's at least one day a year of total darkness. So you probably heard of the land of the midnight sun, or in Alaska, there's parts of Alaska that kind of go 6 months without actually seeing sunshine. This is a feature of this part of the Earth, and it covers a large portion of the Earth actually. So we talked briefly last week about one example of a mammoth that was found called the Brinkendorf mammoth. I'm going to now move on to another example and some other aspects of this that are just mysterious that basically needs to be explained, or we want to find a way to explain this phenomenon. So here's a picture of the first complete baby mammoth that has been found. This was found in 1977 in an exclusive geographical region of about 5.1 million square miles in North Asia. And historically this has been part of Russia. And this region comprises about 77% of Russia's total territory. So this is a very large area. This animal was estimated to be about 6 to 12 months old, and it's a male, and was named Dima, D-I-M-A. And his flattened body, or emaciated body, which means abnormally thin or weak, was buried and well preserved in a lens of solid ice. Very unusual. About 6 feet below the surface of a gentle mountainous slope. And a quote about this find reads, "Portions of the ice were clear and others were quite brownish yellow, with mineral and organic particles embedded. Silt, clay, and small particles of gravel were found inside the digestive and respiratory tracts, or the trachea, the bronchia, and the lungs of this animal." This is an important clue. And we'll discuss why this is an important clue later on as to how this animal came to be where it was. There's also very strong evidence that Dima was vertically compressed and flattened. This would have happened because of an immense amount of weight on top of the animal. It would just crush this animal virtually flat, as you see here in the picture. So these details are all important clues in trying to describe or find out the mysterious mysteries about the circumstances when many of these animals have been found in. So to learn about frozen mammoths, we must first understand much about what's known about their characteristics and the environment that they've been found in. And then next we're going to look into key details and evidences that are requiring an explanation. And then we're going to explore a few of the proposed theories, explaining them, and the flaws in those theories. And so I want you to think about this, explaining the mammoths as a theory, which is basically, in scientific terms, it's a guess basically about how something came to be the way it was, and then you look for evidences that support your theory. And if you find a lot of evidence to support your theory, it gives you great confidence that the theory is the correct theory. And if you can make predictions also, it also gives you a very high degree of, lose it again? Oh no.
Next door.
This happened
Sorry, I
last
need to
week.
note the honors. Let me see.
It's like I've tried 3 times.
Try this again.
Every time, so I don't know.
I think the other classroom is messing us up there. Let's try this. Yeah, the Connors are not playing friendly with us today.
Yeah, he's having trouble finding the right screen. So
Oh, is he?
it's definitely an accident.
That's all right. We'll forgive him. That's all right.
They're persistent.
I guess so. All right. So now we're going to start our slide over again. Hey, there we go. All right. Just wave your hands if this happens again, right? Okay, so to learn what froze these mammoths, we must understand much about the characteristics and the environment in which they were found. So during this, we're going to look into key details and evidences that require an explanation. We're going to examine now then a few of the proposed theories. There's been about 10 theories that have been proposed to explain this. Why these and how these animals were found in the strange circumstances that they've been found in. And then we're going to look at the flaws of some of these theories and see which theory fits the evidences the most correctly. So, the hydroplate theory, which is what we're talking about from this book, seeks to explain the flood and the effects of the flood, and some of the observed effects of the flood, and how these animals could have become frozen in the special circumstances. So think of this as a theory inside of that theory. So we have a theory inside of a theory here. So we should examine numerous theories that attempt to explain any scientific theory, and so we want to look into these unusual details and see which one, actually explains it adequately. And then we'll see, I think at the end of this, that the hydroplate theory is the only theory that really adequately explains this mystery. So first of all, we're going to look at what is known about the characteristics and the environment of where these animals have been found. So how about the climate in which the animal like this would have survived? We're all familiar with certain kinds of animals being adapted to live in particular environments, right? So some animals live in the desert, for example. And we find camels and kangaroo rats and reptiles and snakes and Gila monsters and things like that that live in temperate or desert climates. Arctic climates, however, are totally different. As we talked about above the Arctic Circle, the high during the summertime or during the wintertime in January is actually around 20 to 30 degrees below zero. So that's the high temperature. So we don't find camels and kangaroo rats and reptiles and snakes and Gila monsters in the Arctic. They're just not adapted to live in those conditions. Other animals like frogs and turtles and alligators live on land and water, but they don't live in Arctic climates either. They wouldn't survive in these conditions either. So different species of elephants live in semi-arid deserts like Africa, but they also live in rainforests and tropical regions, but they don't live in Arctic regions. They're just not suited to survive in those regions. So what about mammoths? Where would they likely have been best suited to live? So the common misconception of mammoths is that they lived in areas of extremely cold areas, and it comes primarily from popular drawings like this that depict them with hair or fur to protect them from the cold. So the Arctic regions you see here in this artist's depiction of them shows them in a cold climate. But is this realistic? I think these artists were influenced by earlier opinions based on the mammoth's hairy coat, thick skin, and about a 3.5-inch layer of fat under the skin. But animals with these characteristics don't necessarily live in cold climates. So let's examine these characteristics a little more closely. Because some mammoths had long hair and were found in the Arctic Circle, it is automatically assumed that most of these animals were suited for these cold climates. But animals with hairy coats and thick skin and fat layers don't necessarily live in these cold climates. So the easiest way to, and most accurate way to determine an extinct animal or plant's environment is to identify familiar animals and plants that are in the same area, that were buried nearby. So near the mammoth finds that we looked at just a few slides back, we also uncovered rhinoceros, tigers, horses, antelopes, bison, and temperate species of grasses. So all these animals and plants live in warm and thrive in warm climates. They can't survive in colder climates. So some burrowing animals are found too, such as an animal called a vole, which is a small rodent. It's often called a meadow mice. And they have short tails, blunt noses, and small ears. And these animals would not be able to burrow into the rock-hard frozen permafrost that's found in Siberia. So permafrost basically is a permanently frozen ground that never thaws out. Basically, just, anytime you freeze something because rock hard, well, this animal can't dig into that for food. And even the larva of a warble fly has been found frozen inside a mammoth's intestine. And these are larvae identical to those found in tropical elephants today. So again, this doesn't seem like they're suited for this cold environment like this. So no one argues that these smaller animals and plants buried near the mammoths or found in their digestive tracts were specifically adapted to the Arctic. So why do we do this for mammoths? Why do we assume again that they're suited for these cold weather? So it certainly appears that they would have lived in a much more temperate climate in which they're suited, but something must have happened to them to place them in an area that they now normally wouldn't be able to survive in. So this is part of this unraveling this mystery. These animals are not suited for this environment. It's assumed that they are, because some of them did have hair, but as we'll talk about in just a second, hair doesn't necessarily mean they're adapted for these kinds of environments. So the mammoth hairy coat no more implies an Arctic adaptation than a woolly coat does for a sheep. Sheep don't live in the cold weather, right? But they have woolly coats. So mammoths lacked what are called erector muscles that fluff up an animal's fur and create insulating air pockets. So a man named H. Neville, who conducted the most detailed study of mammoth skin and hair, wrote in the Smithsonian Institutional Annual Report in 1919, it says, "It appears to me impossible to find the anatomical argument or examination of the skin and pelage, which means hair, any argument to favor adaptation to the cold." So they recognized this long ago. This animal, there's nothing, indicating that this thing had to live or did live in cold weather. So long hair on a mammoth's legs hung to its toes. Had it walked in the snow and ice would have caked on its hairy ankles and the hair near its ankles. And each step in and out of the snow would have pulled or worn away the ankle hair. So all hoofed animals that live in the Arctic, including the muskox, have fur and not hair on their legs. It's different. So fur is typically defined as a dense coat of fine hairs that provides insulation, while hair can refer to a more sparse, let's see here, lost my place. I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. That's what happens when you hit the wrong button. Technical problems. So all hoofed animals live in the Arctic, including the muskox, have fur and not hair. So fur is typically defined as a dense coat of fine hair that provides insulation, while hair can refer to the more sparse body hair, even found on humans. So fur, especially oily fur, holds a thick layer of stagnant air, which becomes an excellent insulator between the snow and the skin. So the mammoth's greaseless hair much more snow would touch the skin and melt and increase the heat transfer 10 to perhaps even 100-fold, and the animal would be seriously harmed because of this. So as I did some research on mammoth hair, and as I was doing a search, I was surprised to find you actually can purchase woolly mammoth hair for your very own if you're so inclined. On the internet. You can't find anything on the internet, right? So here's two places you can buy woolly mammoth hair if you want to. You can even get it on eBay. So I'm just letting you know, just in case you want a piece of history for your very own. So I don't really feel inclined to buy mammoth hair, but if you are, this place you can get it. So, so what about the skin? Elephant is closely related to the mammoth, and as you might have guessed. And among the many common aspects of these animals, mammoths and elephant skin are similar in thickness and structure. Both lack oil glands, making them vulnerable or harmed by cold, damp climates. In contrast, Arctic animals or mammals have oil glands and what are called erector muscles, equipment that is absent in mammals. So erector muscles in animals that live in the Arctic serve as a vital role to allow them to survive in cold temperatures. These muscles contract to fluff up the fur in very cold weather. And this thickens the coat and traps this layer of dense, stagnant air near the skin and acts kind of like a dual pane window in your house. You know, a dual pane window traps air between the plates of glass to insulate, and that's basically very similar to what happens with these animals, you know, that have fur. So this is just one of the many countless features for animals that certainly appears to be designed for a purpose. And if you think about this, if this aspect of Arctic animals evolved, as you'll be told by evolutionists, oh, this must have just evolved so they could be adapted for these temperatures, right? What allowed them to survive cold, harsh weather before this feature actually developed? It's like putting the cart before the horse, right? I mean, it's like, how would they develop these things? Adapt for this, previous to it actually being developed. So, again, it doesn't seem to quite make a lot of sense. So the muscles in elephants serve a different purpose, these erector muscles, which has nothing to do with adaptation to cold environments. These specialized muscles in elephants are in their backs, used to support their massive skeletons, and are specialized muscles to allow their ears to move. And we mentioned earlier that mammoths had around 3.5 inches of fat layered under the skin, or within their skin. So some would assume that this fat layer is an insulation from the cold, but it's not always the case. Fat layers are not for cold for all animals. Now there are some animals do have fat layers that form thick barriers under the skin, and that traps the body heat inside and helps keep the animal warm. And keeps the heat from escaping out into harsh environments. However, some animals living in temperate or even tropical zones, such as the rhinoceros, have very thick layers of fat, while many Arctic animals, such as the reindeer, caribou, have little fat. So, cold adaptation animals don't necessarily have fat. Animals that don't live in cold areas do have fat, so it doesn't seem like that necessarily is a correlation. So here's a diagram of the layers of skin for elephants. This is pretty interesting. You can get on these little side tracks, and you might be surprised to learn that there are actually 6 layers of skin on an elephant. This kind of surprised me. I just didn't know it. So the layer that's called the subcutaneous fat layer, or the hypodermis, is underneath this thick dermis layer on top of the muscle and on top of the muscle wall. So in elephants, fat layers act as a foot cushioning that acts as a shock absorber to distribute the 6,000 to 14,000 pounds of weight of a typical elephant. So this allows for near silent movement and also long distance movement. So imagine if your car didn't have any shock absorbers. Okay, imagine your car, no shock absorbers at all. You're driving down a very flat road, perfectly flat, well, you're probably okay, right? But as you get onto a less flat road that maybe has a lot of rocks and potholes, things like that, what would happen? You'd start getting really jarred in your car, right? It would be very fatiguing. It wouldn't be very comfortable. So it's kind of the same thing with these elephants. This layer of fat actually absorbs shocks, so it allows it to walk for great distances without fatigue. So it would make the simple act of walking bearable. Otherwise, it would be very difficult. This fat also serves as a critical function of storing critical energy reserves during seasonal droughts and or periods of scarce food and water, scarce food and water. Unlike aquatic or Arctic mammals that use fat heavily for insulation from the cold, an elephant's fat layer functions primarily for energy storage and buoyancy in water and protection, and not for protection from the cold. So in many animals, these thick fat layers under the skin simply shows that food was plentiful. Abundant food implies a warm, temperate climate. So the thing to realize here is that grown elephants require about 330 to 660 pounds of food per day. And the elephants, which are herbivores or plant eaters, spend most of their day eating, actually. Their digestive system is pretty inefficient. Only about 40 to 60% of what they eat gets converted into energy and nutrients. So therefore, due to how close the mammoth is related to the elephant, it's logical to think that vast quantities of food were needed to support an estimated 5 million mammoths that lived in just a small portion of northern Siberia. Now this 5 million number is based on a number of tusks that were found in the area. Now again, you look at this vast size of this area, we really haven't investigated very much of it. I mean, realistically, logically, there's probably a lot more than 5 million. We don't know for sure, we can't tell, but from things we have seen, estimates have been made of this many of these animals living there. And this is just a small portion of Siberia. So one report of a mammoth discovered in 1799 stated this animal was so fat that its belly hung below its knees. So how could abundant food be available inside the Arctic Circle, especially when the sun rarely shines during the winter months? And we know that sunlight is necessary for plant growth. So where did the plants come from that fed these animals? Another one of these mysteries we want to solve. Earlier we discussed that mammoths have been found primarily in tundras, which are vast treeless regions where frigid temperatures and short growing seasons prevent tree growth. There's no trees in these areas. Again, they're described as permafrost. They're permanently frozen. Soil beneath the surface is permanently frozen, so it supports very little in the way of vegetation. There's a little bit of maybe mosses and small shrubs, but that's about it. So it's hard to imagine, okay, where would these animals find abundant food, 330 to 660 pounds per day, when there's maybe 5 million or more of them? I mean, where did the food come from? It's just, again, another one of these mysteries. It doesn't seem to make sense. And so plants use light energy to power photosynthesis, which is the process of converting carbon dioxide, which they take in the air. They convert that into water and process into sugars for food. So without it, plants would have a very weak growth and eventual death. So again, where did the plants come from? Where did millions of these animals get 330 to 660 pounds of food per day, and they spend roughly 16 to 18 hours a day eating. Okay, that sounds kind of like fun, right? But it's a lot. And also you think about how would they even get food? I mean, imagine shoveling snow all day with the equivalent of 2 curved sticks that are attached to your head. I mean, how would they dig up any food? How would they actually get to the food if it wasn't right on the surface? And the curved tusks of these animals, when they're standing, actually curve upward in such a manner that you couldn't use these to shovel snow. You couldn't get frozen food up out of the ground with tusks. So some mammoths seem better fed than our modern cousins who are surrounded by food, and they don't have to work very hard to expose that. So how could a mammoth work all day clearing snow in the cold just to eat and be fatter than a tropical elephant? Again, it doesn't make any sense. And if you're carrying heavy tusks around, it means you have to do a lot more work, which requires more calories. And they have a lot to do, a lot of work to do just to stay healthy. And I think if it were me, I'd be exhausted, cold, and very hungry with these kind of situations there. In addition to food, elephants also consume somewhere between 30 and 60 gallons of water per day. And if mammoths lived in the Arctic climate with typical temperatures in the summer of just around freezing, this is the summertime, and much lower in the winter, where typical temperatures are between -20 and -30 degrees, water, of course, would have been totally frozen, and virtually permanently. So it means much of all of the drinking water that they would have had in winter must have come from eating snow or ice. And the heat needed by their bodies to melt snow or ice and warm it to body temperature would consume a lot of the elephant's calories as well. So again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, with the average temperature in Siberia in January is -28 degrees. That's 60 degrees below freezing. Another problem too is the long, slender trunk of a mammoth would have been particularly vulnerable or harmed by cold weather. So a 6-foot long nose wouldn't even survive one cold night at 60 degrees below freezing. And what we find with elephants is if their trunk is damaged, the animal usually dies. So an elephant usually dies if its trunk is severely injured. It's essential for breathing and drinking and feeding itself. So severe damage would lead, of course, to starvation, dehydration, or fatal infections. And there's a lot of specialized muscles in the trunk. Again, they can adapt if they lose a small portion of their trunk, but a total loss of the trunk that would most likely occur at 60 or so degrees below zero would generally be fatal to these animals. So we also want to talk about nearby plants and animals. So again, to determine this environment is identify other animals that were in the same area, which we discussed being rhinos, tigers, horses, bison, antelope, things, again, that live in warmer climates. So before examining other facts, we see really three curious problems. First, northern Siberia today is cold, dry, and desolate. Vegetation doesn't grow during the dark Arctic winters. But if their environment was a more temperate area, did their environment change to become cold? Did something happen that changed that environment? And then why did it change if that's the case? And the second, the most well-preserved mammoths and rhinoceros must have been completely frozen very rapidly after death. This is a key clue here too. Otherwise, their internal parts would have quickly decomposed. So we find these animals appear to be flash frozen, extremely quick freezing in very low temperatures. And this is the only way that their soft internal parts could have been preserved without being quickly decomposed. So when an animal dies, it generally starts to decompose relatively quickly. So Dale Guthrie has written about mammoths and noted that an unopened animal continues to decompose long after a fresh kill, even in cold temperatures, because its internal heat can sustain microbial and enzyme activities as long as the carcass is completely covered with an insulating pelt. And because these mammoths have such large reservoirs of body heat, the freezing temperatures that were frozen these animals must have been amazingly low, must have been extremely low. And then finally, their bodies were buried and protected from predators, including birds and insects. So such burials could not have occurred if the ground was perpetually frozen as it is today. And again, this implies that there was a major climate change. But now we can see that it must have changed dramatically and suddenly. And how are most of these animals quickly frozen and buried? Almost exclusively in what's called muck. And we discussed muck earlier, last week, as a dark soil containing decomposed animal and vegetable matter. So there's just all these mysterious things. And there's even more strange evidences that require an explanation. So in an article titled Much About Muck, but you never thought you'd hear about an article about much about muck, right? It is stated that oil prospectors drilling through Alaskan muck have brought up an 18-inch long chunk of tree from almost 1,000 feet below the surface. It wasn't petrified, it was just frozen. However, today's nearest forests are hundreds of miles away. And then Lindsay Williams in publication called The Energy Non-Crisis describes similar discoveries in Alaska. Though the ground is frozen for 1,900 feet down from the surface of Prudhoe Bay, everywhere the oil companies drilled around this area, they discovered an ancient tropical forest, trees that live in a tropical area. They were in a frozen state, not petrified. It is between 1,100 and 1,700 feet down below the surface. And what they found were palm trees, pine trees, and tropical foliage in great profusion. In fact, they found them lapped all over each other, just as though they had fell into that position. So how are trees buried under 1,000 feet of hard frozen ground? Again, we're faced with this same series of questions we saw with the frozen mammoths. Again, it seems it must have been something sudden and dramatic, followed by a rapid burial in muck that's now frozen solid. All these just crazy things that just don't seem to make any sense. But we'll make sense out of it, though. So here's a picture of the remains of a fossil forest found in the New Siberian Islands. So vast floating remains of forests have washed up on the New Siberian Islands, well inside the Arctic Circle, thousands of miles from any other comparable forest. Again, the permafrost in Siberia and above the Arctic Circle there's no trees there. It's too cold for the trees to survive. And this driftwood was washed ashore on Bolshoi Lykov Island. My Russian is good there, it's probably not. Which is one of the New Siberian Islands. And the wood was probably buried under muck that covers northern Siberia. So northward flowing Siberian rivers during the early summer flooding probably eroded some of this muck and released some of these buried forests. And fossil wood is what it's now called, and it's become the main source of fuel and building materials for many Siberians. And there's another picture here from the Kolyma River. It's a river in northeastern Siberia, and it enters into the Kolyma Gulf. And here driftwood is at the mouth of this river on the northern coast of Siberia. Today, no trees of this size grow along this river. So leaves and even fruit have been found on these trees. So one would not expect to see leaves and fruit. These trees have been carried far by rivers, again indicating that there must have been a very rapid burial to preserve these and rapid freezing. Again, being under a frozen layer of muck would have preserved these trees in much the same way your freezer preserves food by dropping it to a temperature so low that it pauses the growth of microorganisms like bacteria and mold that cause decay and spoilage in your food. So the water inside of our food, and in this case trees, which are made up mostly of water, freezes into ice, stopping the chemical reactions, causing decay, and explains how these trees, when then thawed out from the ground, show little to no signs of any decay. Again, another mystery here. These things shouldn't decay. Yeah.
Did these trees just start appearing like over a 10-year period of time? Or did they come all at once, or have they been gathering for years? And are they blaming melting somewhere else for them suddenly winding up there?
Those are questions I don't have probably a ready answer for. I mean, these are probably just a couple of examples, maybe even more. But I think what had probably happened was there might have been a little warmer than normal winter, let's say, in certain areas, allowing some of this muck to unfreeze, allowing the wood underneath, which is going to be buoyant, to rise to the surface, and then that collects like this. So interesting, though. I mean, again, buried forests. I mean, what would have possibly done that? You know, again, we have a catastrophic event that occurred that can explain these things. And again, we'll go through this, and I'll show you how these could be found this way. And then, looking at the mystery of frozen mammoths, we want to look at some specifics about that. We can't minimize this mystery by saying only a few complete mammoths have been reported. So one good case actually would be enough, but we've had many cases. And undoubtedly, probably hundreds of past discoveries went unreported, because many of the Siberians believed that looking at a mammoth's face brought death or misfortune. So it's kind of like a bad luck charm to them. And fear of being forced by scientists to dig a mammoth out of the frozen ground likely suppressed many discoveries. So again, we talked about this vast area, we've only investigated a small part of it. It's kind of like the fossil record. I mean, we've uncovered literally billions of fossils, but we've only scratched the surface of the Earth now. So there likely is, quite a few more that are probably never going to be discovered. Siberia and Alaska are sparsely populated and relatively unexplored. So flowing rivers are the primary excavators, so man's only seen a tiny sample of what's buried. Siberian geologists report that work at the gold mines uncovers frozen corpses every year, but because of the arrival of scientists is delayed and can complicate the mining, most frozen mammoths are actually lost to science, so they're not going to stop the mines, to find a scientist and bring it to the mine. So again, widespread freezing and rapid burial are also inferred when the commercial grade ivory is found. So ivory tusks, unless frozen, protected from the weather, dry out and lose their animal matter and elasticity, and they'll start to crumble and crack, and they'll become useless for carving. Now, a lot of artists carve, ivory into many different artifacts. But beginning at about 1750 and in 1917, trade in mammoth ivory prospered over a wide geographic region, yielding an estimated 96,000 mammoth tusks. And this extent and speed of freezing and burial was probably greater than most people imagined. These tusks were not crumbled and useless for carving. They were so fresh, basically, they could be used for that purpose. So I know this picture's not great. It's from a long time ago, so the resolution's pretty poor. But earlier we discussed the Brankendorf mammoth. So now I want to look at another much more well-documented example of another frozen mammoth. This one's called the Berezovka Mammoth because it was recovered from a nearby river called the Berezovka River. And this is the most famous and well-known of all the mammoths. It's estimated to be about a 50-year-old male and was found in a freshly eroded bank about 100 feet above Siberia's Berezovka River, and this finding was in 1900. And then a year later, in 1901, an expedition led by Dr. Otto Hertz painstakingly excavated the frozen body from the location where it was found. And then 10 pony-drawn sleds hauled the cut-up carcass more than 2,000 miles to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And from there it was transported to the Zoological Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, where it's still on display today. Some of the details of this find were unusual. Berezovka was found in an unusual position. It was upright, although its back was humped and its hind legs were straight and rotated forward at the hips into an almost horizontal position. It's unusual. And as we'll soon discuss, his leg was crushed, but surprisingly he was not lying on his side in a position of agony. So if your leg was crushed, you wouldn't be able to support your weight. You'd have probably fallen over sideways. This animal was not found that way. It was found upright, but his leg was crushed. In addition, generally when an animal dies, it loses control and will generally end up somewhat of a resting or lying position because it would usually fall over due to gravity. So this strange contorted position that Berezovka was found in was further exaggerated by his raised and spread out front legs as if it was struggling to upright itself. So upon death, animals begin a process of decomposition, which will begin to break down the carcass in stages. And we stated many of these finds, due to having being frozen, will stop or greatly reduce the process of decomposition. And we'll see these animals will have to have been extremely rapidly frozen after death, so these internal parts weren't subject to decomposition. So even the internal heat, again, we said, of an animal, even in a cold environment, decomposition still happens, even long after death. So these animals would have had a large amount of internal body heat. It indicates, again, that freezing temperatures would have to have been extremely low. So in the museum, Berezovka was reconstructed and displayed in the same body position it was found, and several ribs, a shoulder blade, and its pelvis were also broken. But amazingly, the long bone in his right foreleg was crushed into about a dozen pieces without noticeably damaging the surrounding tissues. However, there had been considerable bleeding between the muscles and the fatty tissue in this area. It's most likely this leg was crushed after burial, but not before, and here's why. First, it was doubtful that this severely damaged limb could have been used in the spreading or struggling position it was found in, since the smashed bone would have not resisted contraction forces from the muscles, nor could it have supported any weight. Therefore, the limb must have been fully functional at the time of its burial. Second, Berezovka's leg bone was not broken. It was crushed, and it didn't show any evidence of external crushing. So crushing of a mammoth leg bone without evidence of external tissue damage from a large impact, while still showing bleeding in the tissues near the bone, indicates it would have to have been sustained with a very strong vertical compression, where the leg was supported from all sides around the leg. In other words, there must have been something wrapping the leg, causing it to stay where it was in position and then crush the bone. So being externally cased in ice would be a logical explanation for this, how this leg could become vertically crushed. Oops. So if this animal had its legs broken before it was buried, it would likely only break in one place, which would be the weakest place in the bone. For example, if it fell into a deep, cold crevice alone, it would only cause the bone to bend and snap in one place where it was the weakest. So think of pushing a yardstick forcibly at both ends. If you push a yardstick forcibly at both ends, it starts to bend. What happens? It breaks. Does it break into a lot of pieces? No, it breaks pretty much probably in the middle. It probably is its weakest point. But here, Berezovka's leg was crushed in about a dozen or so pieces. So this indicates that the leg must have been supported so that it was not able to bend. So continued rapid burial from above would have vertically compressed the bone, and the weight from above would have shattered the bone, but in place. So it's a totally different than failure mechanism that would have been expected. So this continued heavy burial above the mammoth must have happened soon, or maybe during the animal's death, for the bleeding in local tissues to have occurred before they froze. So the extremely cold preservation indicates that the burial material must have also been extremely cold. So below its right forefoot was the end of a very hairy tail, or a bovine of an animal, probably a bison. And again, this indications that this animal was buried along with other animals that don't necessarily live in these cold temperatures. The whole landslide of the Berezovka River was the richest imaginable storehouse for prehistoric remains. So in the surrounding soil, they found an antelope skull, a prehistoric horse, tree trunks, tree fragments and roots, vegetation that differed from the amazingly well-preserved plant in the mammoth's mouth and stomach. We'll talk about that. I've heard the Bell will probably do that next week. But what was found in this animal's mouth and stomach is astounding. So many times fossils like this are found in groups at high points in the land's topography, and sometimes they're referred to as fossil graveyards. So fossil graveyards are all over the world. We'll find amazing numbers of animals and plants all buried at the same place. It must have been at the same time for all to be buried in the same way, but a wide variety of animals that never lived together at the same time. So you'll find like sharks next to horses, and odd things. So again, there's something unusual going on here, and that would produce these fossil graveyards. So, all right, heard the bell. We'll have to pick up there next week.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Any questions at all? Yes.
What about the blood? How fast does the blood take to decompose?
How long?
How long?
Decomposition typically starts right at death, and usually within a few hours.
Was there blood in those carcasses they found?
In this one it was, but it was frozen.
Okay.
It didn't really decompose. And we'll talk too about cells that froze so rapidly that they didn't burst. We'll talk about that next week. So typically as temperatures go lower and lower and water gets closer to the freezing point, at about 39 degrees, a really strange thing happens to water that's designed by God, I think, is that instead of continuing to contract and become more dense, like most liquids do, at 39 degrees and lower, it starts to expand. So it actually starts to expand, which makes it lighter than the water, which allows ice to float. So, but if, and if ice didn't float, we'd be in trouble. That's a huge problem. But these cells were typically, as they approach freezing, the cells typically would burst. But this happened so fast that the cells didn't burst. So again, there's another.
I was curious if we got blood for DNA testing and stuff like they did. I assume-
They might have DNA tested it. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I'd be kind of curious if they did.
Yeah. They know what the animal is. That's not a mystery there. So
All right, thank you.
anyway, you're welcome. Thank you.